Here's Alex O'Connor to try to get William Lane Craig to explain how God can create the universe.
I know it's not strictly the conclusion of the Kalam, or maybe you think it is, but I've heard you talk in the past about how once we identify that there's a cause to the universe, we can say that it's a personal cause, let's say,
Yes.
because of the fact, and I may be misunderstanding here, but my interpretation was that it has to kind of do something to create a universe, right? And if an infinite being creates a finite thing, that doesn't seem to make sense unless the infinite being can change its nature in some sense. But how can we understand this outside of the idea of time, right? Because when I first heard that kind of line of thought, I was thinking, well, are we saying that there's an infinitely existing being who, because at some point in time creates the universe, something must change, and therefore it must be a kind of conscious decision-making cause? Without time, I don't see how that jump can be made.
What is unclear to me is what it even means to do something without there already being time in which to do it. How can God carry out the act of creating time without time already existing in which to carry out that act?
I wouldn't express it exactly the way you did, but I think that you're in the ballpark. The problem here is, how do you get an effect with a beginning from a cause which is permanent?
Yes.
Well, what does it even mean to be permanent? That makes it sound like God has existed for an infinite amount of time, but that's not possible if time itself doesn't stretch infinitely into the past. Craig asserts that God can exist without time, but I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, because it seems to me that to say that something exists is to say that it has extension, or at least location, in time. I don't understand the difference between saying that something exists without time and saying that it never exists. Alex's problem seems to be that if God is permanent but created a universe that is past finite, some kind of change had to occur from God being in some eternal timeless state, whatever that is even supposed to mean, to God making a universe a finite time ago.
If the cause is truly sufficient for its effect, then if the cause is there permanently, the effect ought to be there permanently. How in the world do you have a permanent cause but an effect that only begins to exist a finite time ago? And it seems to me that the best answer to that question is that the cause is a personal agent endowed with free will, because free will can initiate new effects without antecedent determining conditions.
I'm not convinced that free will exists, because there's no reason to think that any of our thoughts simply happen without antecedent neurological causes. Also, there seems to be something internally contradictory about the idea of free will, because folks who advocate it don't seem to be saying that our choices are made randomly or for no reason. But to say that our choices have no antecedent causes means exactly that. If nothing predetermines any particular choice that one makes, then that choice happens for no reason. That choice was random. Moreover, if God made the free choice to create the universe, then that means he did so randomly and for no reason. Another problem with the idea that the creation of the universe had to be a free choice by a conscious person is that it assumes that if there are such things as events with no antecedent causes, such events are restrained to choices made by persons. I see no reason to assume this to be the case. If our minds can do things without being caused to do them, what reason do we have to believe that minds are the only things that can do this?
And so what I would say is that this timelessly existing free agent freely wills to create the universe, and therefore time comes into being at that moment, and this being enters into time at that moment.
So when God freely wills the universe to exist, does he go from a state in which he hasn't yet willed the universe to exist to a state in which he does will it to exist? If so, that would be a change, and how can a change occur without time? A change, by definition, is a difference in a state of affairs at one point in time and a state of affairs at a later point in time.
So this is the problem I'm having, is you say he wills the universe into being at that moment. But how can we make sense of a term like at that moment if this being is timeless? Because as you say, if it's an infinite being, the question is, if that cause is sufficient and infinite, then the effect should also be infinite, implying that there was no sufficiency up to a certain point. But how can you talk about points with no time?
Exactly. Even if the universe exists because God freely willed the universe to exist, did that will only start existing 13.7 billion years ago? If God is permanent, why wasn't the will to create the universe permanent? What explains the change?
This is a great question. And the question here you're raising is, which one is explanatorily prior? God's decision to create the world is simultaneous with the origin of the world. They're at the same moment, the first moment of time.
If that's the case, then it is not coherently causal. We never see causes simultaneous with their effects because none of the interactions we ever see propagate instantaneously. To say that God's will propagates instantaneously is special pleading.
So which is explanatorily prior? Is it the moment of time? And it is at that moment that God chooses? Or is it rather that God makes a free choice and therefore that is the first moment of time? And I would say it's the latter. God's free choice is explanatorily prior.
How can something be explanatorily prior without being temporally prior? That would require interactions to propagate instantaneously, which we have never seen them do.
Two, the existence of the first moment of time, because in the absence of some sort of an event, there would be no time. It would just be timelessness.
But how can any event occur without time already existing? Time is a prerequisite for the occurrence of events. No event, therefore, can be a prerequisite for the existence of time. You can't carry out the act of creating something that already exists, and there was obviously never a time when time did not already exist. Craig once argued that time can't be created before time exists, because there's no such thing as before time, and he couldn't have created time after it exists, because then it's too late. Therefore, he must have created it at its first moment. The problem I see is that the first moment of time is also too late to create it. It already exists at that first moment.
You need something to happen in order for time to exist. And what happens is that God freely chooses to create the universe.
You need time to already exist for anything to happen. Happenings cannot occur without time already existing.
So it's all about explanatory priority here.
So the insufficiency of the cause before, let's say, if it's the wrong language, but before the universe exists, the insufficiency of the cause, which means that it hasn't existed yet, is prior in explanation rather than prior in time.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that what you call the insufficiency of the cause is due to the fact that the free will of this being has not chosen to create the universe. This being has not made such a decision.
What would it mean for God to change from not having decided to create the universe to having decided to create the universe without time already existing in which that change occurs? That makes no discernible sense to me.
But the instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being. Indeed, the decision is explanatorily prior to the first instant of time.
Yeah. When you say the free, it's because of the freedom of the being and the free being hasn't made the decision. It feels like that it's begging for the word yet to be on the end of that. It hasn't made the decision yet.
I know.
You know? But it's
Yes.
like we're carefully avoiding that language because of the complications of time. But it seems like the explanation that you're giving, it feels to me like naturally it invokes a sense of time. I still don't quite see how it works without time.
Well, you just have to be very careful if you're going to be philosophically precise to use tenseless verbs in your sentences and not use temporal particles like before or yet and things of that sort. And I think that we can avoid those and make coherent statements. For example, I said, sans the universe, God exists timelessly. That's a tenseless verb. Sans the universe, God does not freely choose to create the universe.
That's not discernibly coherent to me. I don't understand what it means to exist sans time. How can something exist if it never exists? Also, when Craig says that God exists in a state without time in which he is not deciding to create the universe, and existing in a state with time in which he is deciding to create the universe, he seems to be asserting that these states are neither simultaneous nor sequential. I can conceive of no coherent third option to this dichotomy. How can something be in two distinct states, neither at the same time nor at sequential times? That doesn't make any sense to me.
So I think that these statements can be correctly made if we just watch our tenses and our adverbs.
Sure. So I should say to the listeners, I'm going to leave resources and writings that Dr. Craig has made on these points, because there's no way you can get to the bottom of them in a podcast like this. But the reason that I wanted to kind of talk about this for a little bit was because of the fact that one of the objections that has been made, and I think I've made it in the past, is this idea that, yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument gets you a cause of the universe, right? But it doesn't get you something resembling a god. But here, what we're doing is we're trying to show that in order, if we kind of admit that there is a cause of the universe that's outside of the universe and is therefore timeless, eternal, infinite, whatever it may be, that it does in fact have to be personal. It does in fact have to have free will and some form of consciousness. And so the Kalam actually does imply a type of cause, not just a cause. I think that's, yes. Does that make sense?
Well, it does to me. This is Al-Ghazali's argument for the personhood of the cause of the universe. This isn't original with me. It's in Al-Ghazali's work. And when I first read it, I thought, this is absolutely brilliant. This is the only way that you can get a temporal effect with a beginning from a permanent cause.
Again, that's only if you assume that a person making a conscious choice requires no antecedent causes, and also that a person making a conscious choice is the only kind of event that can occur without antecedent causes. Both of these assumptions seem baseless to me.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.